Chair calls Kathryn Robb, National Director of the Children's Justice Campaign at Enough Abuse. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, members, as well. And again, my name is Kathryn Robb, and I am the National Director of the Children's Justice Campaign at Enough Abuse. I'm also a survivor of child sexual abuse by a family member, but my role here today is primarily as a national expert on child protection legislation. I've been doing this for 22 plus years. I testify all over the country for any sort of child protection legislation. So you have to be kind of living under a rock to not know that we are living in an epidemic of child sexual abuse. The research says somewhere between 1 in 9 or 1 in 11 children will be sexually assaulted before their 18th birthday. If that's not an epidemic, I don't know what is. All children are affected, regardless of their race, culture, religion, parents, political backgrounds, right? It affects all of our children, and all children are in danger. And the burden really sits on the state. The burden is on the backs of taxpayers because this epidemic just destroys lives. It affects our educational system. It affects our social service systems. It affects our medical systems, our mental health systems, our penal systems, law enforcement. I mean, you name it. It just has a financial burden on taxpayers and certainly the state of Texas. But in addition to that burden, and it's monumental, is the problem that we see with NDAs and what you've heard here already today. Historically, NDAs have been used to protect in business and employment, trade secrets, confidential list, that sort of thing. And that makes sense. That's sound public policy to me. Not to cover up wrongs and crimes, especially against children, right? That wasn't the intent ever for NDAs. It was to protect businesses, employers, and their confidential trade secrets, confidential information, that sort of thing. Presently, we have 17 states and Congress that have passed laws that prohibit the use of NDAs overall for sexual abuse cases, but primarily for sexual harassment. We are seeing more states entertain specifically a narrowly drawn bill to address ending NDAs for child sexual abuse, because it's really such a horrendous wrong and crime. They're simply just contrary to public policy. It doesn't make sense to silence victims, and they do. They silence victims, but they also endanger children, and this would be the piece that I'd really like to emphasize here today. They endanger children because they shield sexual predators, right? They cover up prosecutable crimes against children, mostly felonies against children. They conceal negligent acts and practices by institutions and organizations. And as we've already heard, they re-traumatize victims. And overall, when that happens, it prevents victims from fully healing, right? From fully moving forward and having a healthy life. Although this is something that survivors live with, for decades and decades. We know that it takes years and years for decades for survivors to come forward. Many take this ugly secret to their grave. I would like to share just a personal story. This is my son, my oldest son. I'm a mother of 5. This is my oldest son, Jesse, and he's 9 years old in this picture, playing Little League, right? And a year and a half ago, my son, who is now 30, came into my office, and he sat down. He closed the door, and he sat down.
This is your son?
That's my son, but he's now 30,
okay.
Yes. And he came into my office, and he sat down, and he said to me, "Mom, I really need to talk to you." And I said, "Okay." And he broke into tears, and he said, "Mom, when I was 9 years old, remember you took me to the ER for this illness he had. He had a high fever. And I said, yeah, I remember. And he said, well, the doctor took me to the basement of the hospital and he raped me. And my son held that secret for, 22 years or so, right? And I'm in this business. I've been doing this for 22 years, and I thought as a parent I'd be able to see it. I always knew something was wrong with my son. Something wasn't quite right, right? He had an issue with alcohol. He had an issue with drugs. And I knew that something wasn't right, and this was what made sense to me. Of course, it blew me away. As a mother, I still carry a lot of guilt and shame of not going when the doctor said, we're taking your son for a test. How would I ever know that I would not be able to trust a doctor at an ER and that he would take my sick son with a very high fever to the basement and rape him? There's no way I would know that. But the reason I'm sharing this story is because my son said to me at the end of that, in a bucket of tears, Mom, I have felt like I have been held under an ocean of water, and today I came up to breathe. But if he has to sign an NDA, he will be pushed under that ocean of water again. And that's just to illustrate how inappropriate NDAs are for child sexual abuse claims. Now, I know, and I'll just end with this, I know, just because I testify all over the country, I know that a lot of organizations and institutions will say, well, you know what, we're not going to do that anymore. Just this is going to be our policy, this is going to be our procedure, this is going to be our new day forward. But it can't be up to them. It cannot be up to an institution. You have the power, you have the authority to not silence children and victims again, right? We can't have it be up to them. It has to be law that NDAs do not make sense in child sexual abuse cases. Now, I would say they don't make sense in most cases, sexual abuse cases or harassment cases. We certainly saw this with the Speak Out Act at the federal level, but it's just bad policy. And it is the legislative body that has the power, the authority, and I would say the wisdom to change this law so we can protect our children. Thank you.